Good morning, Central Kentucky. This is Sandra Leslie White coming to you from WJMM Studios here in Versailles, Kentucky, right outside of Lexington, Kentucky, shouting out to all of you around the country on WJMM.com and Facebook. Good morning. And today we're just going to talk about the law. Okay, so we've been talking about some serious subjects all week, particularly the last couple of shows on self-destruction. But I wonder about this idea of the law of God that is keeping us in bondage and in a place where we really can't live up to the standards we think God has for us. So, I wonder why these laws exist, right? Have you ever wondered about that? I mean, the laws of the land, to govern the land, to protect the people. Or is it to rain on our parade? You know, we don't really always like all these laws about the speed limit or texting or things of that nature. And we're always looking for ways around them, aren't we? Well, some think that way about God's laws as well. Let's look into that, about what Hosea really says about the law of God and what it really is, in part or in whole. So let's go on to Hosea 4:6 and Matthew 22:37-40 today. Title of the message is The Whole Law. So let's dig in this morning. In the New American Standard Version, Hosea 4, verse 6. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will also reject you from being my priest. Since you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. All right, we're wrapping up the teaching this week on Hosea 4:6, and now looking at the law. Looking at the law. I don't know. Whenever I think about looking at the law, I'm thinking about looking at some police officer that's pulled me over and is at my door knocking on my window, and I'm so nervous I can't get it down, and I'm just looking at the law when I finally look at him or her in the eye. So, but to look at the law of God, and to see that he is emphasizing this, meaning Hosea writing this in the latter part of the 8th century BC to the northern kingdom, as well as addressing the southern kingdom in chapter 4. And he's using this metaphor, as we know, of his holy Hosea, the prophet who was commanded to marry a prostitute named Gomer, as this picture, this metaphor of God's relationship with his wayward people. And so it goes back and forth between love and rejection, it seems, throughout Hosea. Is that the way it is with us today as well? Well, he looks at this whole idea of not being rejected in this terms that we think about being rejected. You know, yesterday's show was about being drained or having a meltdown. That's what that word rejected really means, because you have had a meltdown or you've been drained of knowledge because of your involvement, interaction, intercourse, actually, in the day with the local gods of the temple. Those were prostitutes of the day that provided fertility to the people, the Canaanite gods. And this is where we might have seen Gomer come forth from and return to. So it is this idea of being drained of knowledge, drained of the intimacy with Yahweh, drained of all the attributes, drained of true dependency on him, because, and we're going to get to a surprising point here, they have forgotten the law of their God. And so, law. Let's look at that word. In the Hebrew is Torah. Well, we know the Torah. You know, the Torah, that essentially means teaching in the Hebrew vernacular. But let's listen to this out of Spiro Zodhiates' Hebrew lexical aids to the Old Testament. He says this: the meaning is instruction or doctrine, regulation, direction, precept, statute. He goes on, and it is used so many times. The Old Testament usage of this word about 220 times. The essential meaning of Torah is teaching, whether it is wise man who gently instructs his own son or God patiently teaching Israel. And he goes on to say, can refer to any set of regulations. The book of Deuteronomy clearly shows that the law of Moses encompasses history, statutes, interpretations, exhortations. And yet he then lands on this fascinating perspective. He says this: so Torah was much more than a law or set of rules. So somebody need to hear that. It is more than the law or set of rules. It was not to be perceived as restrictions, but the very means by which one could reach a spiritual ideal. Okay. All right. I like that. Okay. Let me repeat it. So this is not about a set of rules. This is not about restrictions. This is not about any of that we might think of with the law of God. But it means that it is the means by which one could reach a spiritual ideal. If Israel would keep the Torah, then Israel would be kept safe. Okay. All right. If we keep the law while we're driving down the road and not texting, does that keep us and someone in the oncoming lane safe? I think so. But this is even deeper than that. However, the people came to understand it as something which was imposed for its own sake rather than what God intended for them to become. Okay. He intends for us to become something, not just to obey and be a robot. He's trying to transform us, and we're going to become something. Oh my goodness. Therefore, the means became the end. And instead of being seen as a guideline, it became a heavy external set of rules, which were stifling. Failure to understand the perfect law of liberty led to severe legalism as taught by the Judaizers in the first century. Paul struggled to define the true place of the law in Romans 1-8 and Galatians 1-3. And I think the most important thing that can be said here is that the law of God is liberty. Jesus came to break through the religious rules of the day, to put us into motion, to become free and filled with His presence, His teaching, His purpose, and be transformed into what this definition means as a spiritual ideal, transformed into the image of Christ. So when we think about the law, it is not a bunch of restrictions. It is so much deeper than that we are being transformed by the very laws of God, the presence of God, and the purpose of God into becoming like Christ, into becoming more like His Son. So it's very prophetic in Hosea 4:6. Of course, everything in Hosea, everything in the Old Testament, prophetic to the New. But I think since we have forgotten the law of our God, that means in Hosea 4:6, backing up into the first sentence, we're destroyed by lack of knowledge of God, the intimate relationship with God, using all of our senses to really know who He is, to know who we are, and to be able to reconcile all of that mess into this beautiful mess of humanity. And so the purpose of God even coming into the world, sending his son, as opposed to the law through the prophets, was to manifest himself to mankind so that we could actually see what we could become. We could become like Jesus. That's what the law is all about. So, in terms of the law being forgotten, and then if it's forgotten in our generation, it will be forgotten in our children's generation. That's his point in making that statement. Since you have forgotten the law of your God, I'll also forget your children. Sounds pretty harsh. But the real translation there, the transliteration there, the Hebrew to English, means that if you forget it, they'll forget it too. So it is so critically important that we understand the deeper meaning of the law. So I love this. And I want to go to Matthew right now and listen to, I've talked about this before on a previous show about the law and the prophets, but I just love what Jesus says about the law. Here we go. So that Old Testament statement about forgetting the law of God is going to be fulfilled in a New Testament statement from Jesus himself. So he's answering, he's in this, he's always coming up against the religious rulers of the day. And at this time in Matthew, he's answering the Sadducees, who were saying, if a man dies, has no children, his brother's next of kin, shall he marry his wife, raise up an offspring to his brother? They ask him these ridiculous questions. Anyway, so Jesus comes back and says this. When a lawyer comes up to him and asks him, testing him, Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law? Okay, well, in the law, that is Matthew 22:36. And here's Jesus' answer. He said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. This is the greatest and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. The whole law and the prophets are summed up in this. So we know that Jesus adds to the law in 37. Don't you love him? That was out of Deuteronomy 6:5. He said to them, and I'll repeat it, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. And that soul, I think, combines the mind and heart. This is a great and foremost commandment. So they all knew this. The Sadducees knew it. The Pharisees knew it. All the Jews knew it. They all knew this was part of the Torah, the teaching, the law. And then he adds to it. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So I want us to really understand loving your neighbor as yourself means you love yourself first so that you can love your neighbor. So here's the order. God so loved the world. He didn't want you to perish so that you will love yourself and be filled with his love so you can love your neighbor. And then on these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. So there's the whole law, and it is grounded and rooted in this powerful love of God. And if we don't understand the law and the whole law of love and powerful love, we cannot function in this world by loving our neighbor and being transformed into the image of Jesus. Ooh, that's our spiritual ideal. So let's keep going with this teaching as we go on into Hosea chapter 4. God bless you today.